couple different reasons.
Hello, and welcome to We the Village, produced by Ron Hall, and I'm your host, Sharonda Allen. I'm extremely elated to have the wonderful, wonderful Dr. Leonard Jeffries here as my guest today for this episode. He is a PanAfrican Afrocentrist. Dr. Jeffries, welcome.
Well, certainly, Sharonda, I'm delighted to be here. We the Village,
Yes.
and certainly to deal with the importance of our history,
Yes.
and why we need to be clear about that as we fortify ourselves and go forth.
Yes, so I gave you this title in the introduction, Pan-African Afrocentrist. Can you explain to our viewers what that means for people who are not quite sure?
Certainly. Pan-African, pan is the Latin word for all.
Yes.
And so Pan-African would be all African. Now that would mean that I identify with black people wherever they are.
Yes.
And Afrocentrist refers to the consciousness that you can have a focus and a perspective that's Eurocentric.
Yes.
Meaning that your learning, your values and whatnot have been centered around the European way of life,
Yes.
or Asian, so that over the last 50, 60 years, or even for me before that, I've been grounded in an African-centered view of the world.
So how many decades have you been Afrocentric and African-centered in your view of the world and in your learning and teaching?
Well, one of our great TV personalities, Brother Gil Noble,
Yes.
he had the program on ABC Like It Is.
Yes.
And whenever he would have me on, or Dr. Clark or Dr. Ben, some of the great scholars, he would ask us, well, when did you get these ideas? When
Yes.
did this consciousness become? And so I used to tell him, Gil, all of my life. And he said, well, how could it be all of your life? I said, my pablum, growing up in Newark, New Jersey, in our village in Newark, which was the Roseville district, my pablum was not Little Red Riding Hood, Jack and the Beanstalk, and all of these Cinderella. It was Booker T, W.E.B., and Marcus Garvey.
Right.
In other words, Booker T. Washington had a philosophy of self-development, put your buckets down where you are, and grow and develop. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of our great scholars, and he said we really need a talented tenth of people who've mastered the knowledge and can be our leaders. And then Marcus Garvey, inspired from about Africa, came from the Caribbean with a view that no matter what language we spoke and no matter what island or what state we were from, we were African peoples,
Yes.
the original peoples. And so that's been a great, for me, that's been with me from the very beginning. And but what it did was it allowed me to have this flow coming from the African-centered world and then the European-centered world. And then I've been able to integrate it.
Yes.
So I have what I call my $1 million white boy education.
Where was that, sir?
That means it started in Newark schools. We got a good education in the Newark schools. Went to Barringer High School. I graduated as president of the grammar school.
Nice. Which
5
grammar
or 6
school?
of us black youngsters, but Sussex Avenue School.
Sussex Avenue in Newark.
Near Bergen.
Yes.
I was the president at that time with our black friends, but the majority of the students were white. Then I went on to Barringer High School, and I was a leader of Barringer High School.
Yes.
Both schools gave us sound education
Yes.
from the European perspective, but we had a chance to add the African perspective.
Yes.
So I remember my first 6 years was at Roosevelt Avenue School, and then we went for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade to Sussex. And in the 6th grade in Roosevelt Avenue School, I did a paper on Egypt. And I was also an artist, so I did the cover.
Nice.
And on the cover, I had the 3 pyramids of Giza.
Yes.
It was handwritten, 21 pages, talking about, it's amazing, that a young black youngster in a white school in Newark, New Jersey, would be able to put out that information in this paper. But my mother was the key. She, and a chapter of that in my story is going to be, where's the funk? And people are going to say, well, what is Dr. Jeffries talking about? Where's the funk? But what I'm talking about is the Funk and Wagnall encyclopedia
Yes.
that my mother had the genius to buy and put in our living room.
Yes.
In the secretariat. Now the secretariat was, you could open it up and you could write, and you had the book. So
Yes.
the Funk and Wagnall encyclopedia was there. So I was able to get information that I needed to put in my paper from my own home, from
That's
my
right.
living room. And my mother was that type of a person. She laid the foundation. My father was very supportive, but she was the one that was big on education. So my first paper I did was on Egypt, and I got a C.
How?
Not even a C plus, just a C.
C.
I mean, I did the artwork. I had a picture that I copied inside.
Oh,
Then the
boy.
next paper was on Mesopotamia.
Oh, yes.
And same thing, I designed the cover and I had the picture inside, and I got a B. Then the next one was Greece.
I know you got an A.
I
didn't
got
you?
an A. I got an A. So I kind of joke about it, but I guess I was a surprise for this teacher when she saw the first paper. And we had penman drills, so it was written, this left-handed, writing the wrong way.
They say wrong way, I'm left-handed too.
And they trained us. You know, in some cultures they say no if you, and then other cultures, some cultures in Africa want you to use this hand because this is the hand where you eat with, and this is the hand where you do other things.
Yes.
And so, but I was a left-handy. I just learned to write upside down, and I did it well.
Turn the paper, that's all.
Right. But I guess when she got the first paper, it was kind of a surprise. So you got to see. I describe it as a C for being colored.
Yes, I was going to say.
A little colored boy.
C for colored.
Yes.
That's what I was gonna say.
And then when I did the second paper on Mesopotamia and drew a Mesopotamian warrior and whatnot.
Ishtar Gate and all that.
Right. I got a B.
For black.
For black. And then when here comes a third one, she said, well, this youngster he's reaching high.
Yes.
And so I had to give him an A for African.
Yes.
And, but luckily I have all those. My mother saved everything. I have every report card I ever had.
Oh.
And she went to Essex County Community College in her later years, and so she was into education and recording things. So I had to give thanks. And here's
beautiful.
a picture of what I am all about. Mrs. Leonard Jeffries, coming up from Virginia. Her father was a very prominent, hardworking individual, and I was born on his birthday, January the 19th.
Yes.
So when I came into the world, I mean, this is someone born on Papa's birthday, so that made it well. But then I had to share my world. Within 21 months, my baby brother was born.
So you're the knee baby, as they call it.
Yes, and then he was cute and whatnot. Oh, goodness. And so but my mother was smart. She said to us, you're the elder, you have responsibility for the younger brother. The younger brother, that's your elder brother, and you've got to learn from him.
Yes.
So there was no conflict and whatnot. And us growing up together.
That's parenting.
Yes.
Right there.
Now my brother got married, and he had 2 youngsters, and so that's what this is. This is in the Great Temple in Egypt, where we took 1,000 people in 1987.
Okay.
And I helped 30 people go, including Gil Noble. And also my nephews. This is the youngest one, Hassan. He's about 12 years old. And Hakeem, who is now the Congressman, Hakeem Jeffries.
Yes.
He is, this is him at 14. And this is one of the great pillars. They're so large that about 8 people holding hands could fit around the great pillars in the Great Lodge. Now this was the first university center of significance in the world. And the Greeks and others copied these institutions. So that's why African-centeredness means we go back to the root and we begin to understand. And Hassan is now a professor at Ohio State.
Nice.
And then Hakeem is the congressman. He graduated at NYU Law School at the top of the law school.
Beautiful. He's putting it to work as a congressman.
Yes, and he'll be having now he's number 4 or 5 in the Democratic Party structure.
Nice.
So he's got to work with all of these aspiring individuals who want to be the candidate for the presidency, even though some of them still have a little ways to go in terms of growth.
Did you want to talk about that now? You ready?
But we live in we live in what we call a free country. We have what we call a democracy.
Yes.
And that means that anybody that thinks that they're ready can put their hat in the ring.
So I'm going to ask you, how do you feel about, first of all, I know that the Obamas are very near and dear to your heart.
Yes.
And I personally believe that they left a beautiful legacy in this country, in the White House. Some people say they didn't do enough for African Americans. I think they did so much for this country, and they did a lot for African Americans, but of course they didn't. It was not going to be publicized as big. But can you just share your thoughts and your feelings about the Obamas and their impact on the society and the culture?
My approach to learning and understanding is that you need a systems analysis.
Yes.
If you don't have a systems analysis, meaning you've done some serious research and you put things together and you made them make some sense, you get what I call a paralysis of analysis.
Yes.
And most of us, we don't do the serious work, or we haven't grown into doing it, and we get a little bit of something and then we extrapolate from that into these larger questions. You can't do that. That creates a paralysis of analysis.
Yes.
To have a black man win the presidency of the United States was an enormous, serious event.
Yes.
The country was on the brink of one of the worst collapses economically and politically it could have.
Yes.
And it appears that in this history of America, when there is a difficult situation and there's a problem, the white power structure says, go to black and see whether the black persons can pull us out of it. Now, Washington and Jefferson in the beginning of this country, well, let's go further. With the establishment of the colony in 1619 in Virginia, my mother had Virginia roots, my father had Georgia roots, but 1619 is the beginning of this country.
Yes.
The colony that was established at Jamestown was in trouble. They did not know how to clear the land. They didn't know about farming this land. Part of my family is the Powhatan Indian component, and the Powhatan taught them how do you deal with the corn and whatnot in this new land.
Right.
They did not know how to, they didn't have a science of hunting.
Right.
So in point of fact, the colony established in 1607 or thereabouts, Jamestown. By 1619, they were in a starvation mode.
Yes, they were.
And they needed to be rescued.
And who did they bring?
The Native Americans decided that these people are not correct. We're going to turn our back on them. We're going to go take care of our own business. And on the horizon came a Dutch man of war that had been pirating so-called slave ships. And that Dutch man of war sold 20 Africans into the Virginia colony. 1620. And from that point, Jamestown was able to survive.
And thrive.
And thrive.
They had
and
free
it
labor.
spread along. And then there was a group of Europeans coming from England that wanted to join Jamestown. But there was a storm, and that threw them off course. So they wound up landing in Plymouth Rock.
Yes.
And in Plymouth Rock, they could not survive in that environment. They had to ask the Native Americans, our people, yes, to help them. And our people were curious about who were these new people, and they felt that they could work with them. And so they helped them. That's why there is a Thanksgiving, because they were able to survive with the help of the Native Americans. So here you have the oldest colony, Jamestown, the new colony, Plymouth Rock, and they both survived because of us.
Right.
And the tragedy is that instead of following that with some support and working with us, it reversed itself. In other words, the Native American populations over these hundreds of years have been wiped out. The worst genocide in the history of the world, if you will. Millions destroyed all over the Americas. And the African population, which helped to save this experiment in this new world, proved to be so successful, they said, we can't do without this. So they made slavery a part of the founding in the 1600s. They made it a part of the new nation in the 1700s. They made it a part of the industrialization in the 1800s. And then we get into the 1900s. They needed us in the world wars. And then when the system was about to collapse, they said, let's go back to black.
Right.
And there was.
And here's Barack
There was Barack.
And what did he do? I believe he brought things back from the brink.
Things back. And we can't leave him out there as an individual.
Yes.
The person who was his support, of course, was his mother.
Yes.
Was a European. And then he had his father who had gone back from the country, but his grandmother and whatnot raised him. But when Barack needed to have a support, he wasn't running to the Democratic Party.
No.
He wasn't going down to some club and whatnot. He had it in his partner for life, Michelle. So their relationship of a partnership is a story in and of itself. And I appreciate Michelle because she went to Princeton following her brother. So she has a Princeton BA. And that's where the elite of white America was trained. And then the capstone of that elite education is to go to Harvard or Yale. So she went to Yale Law School. She graduated before Barack. So, and in fact, she was the one that brought him into Chicago and helped him get a job. And so when he was brought into the White House, who was there? With all of her physical Africanity, queen mother, and she wasn't, and they had two little angels, and they wasn't going to put them into the hands of no nannies or whatnot coming in from Sweden. They went and got mama and mama-in-law,
from the South
Side, and from South Carolina, raised her angels in the White House, and then, so that's the beauty of it. And she wasn't sitting there like a beautiful, intelligent woman or a mother or what. She was in the mix in terms of ideas and sharing and bouncing things off of them.
And wisdom.
So you had a real White House experience that was blackened up in ways that we can't imagine.
And
so that's a story that has to be told for the ages. And then he left the White House and went worldwide. And wherever he went, he goes to Berlin, the biggest crowds they've had, hundreds, thousands of people in Berlin to see a black man. That was Hitler's territory. And here is, the world has changed, so now a black man can go there and speak his special truth. And then he went to the Middle East, and they expected, since he had roots in Africa, and they expected something from him. So wherever he went, demands were made. Brother, can you do it? Can you heal this devastation of relationships that we had? And he provided that. No matter what you say he did not do, he did the impossible.
He did.
Houses were going. middle class affected, banks were going, insurance companies were going. This country was headed for a devastation, and they went to black, and it saved the day.
Absolutely.
And so we need to see that in a larger reference as a metaphor, that we need to go to black. We are looking for white folks to save us, and they got problems saving themselves.
Oh, look at what's going on right now.
And you've got somebody in the White House, I won't even say his name.
Don't say it's like Beetlejuice.
And we don't know who that is. What is his education? What is his formation? What is his relationship to women?
Terrible.
What is relationship to trying to raise children?
Terrible.
What is relationship to institutions, education, schools? His whole thing is business. And that business thing is very questionable.
And it's failed business.
And then he's learned how to profit off of failed business.
Always.
Getting in debt and then climbing up out of debt. Claiming you own something when you really are only allowing your name to be used.
That's it.
So that's a reality. So hopefully others will be in the mix to try to deal with that reality. I'm proud to say that this young man who graduated at the top of NYU Law School and was the graduation speaker, and his brother who graduated from Morehouse, the black school in Atlanta, and he graduated with all A's except one B.
Right.
That this young man is now trying to do what he can do to move things in the right direction and turn things around. And his brother is at Ohio State. He's got 3 angels, 3 little beautiful daughters, and his great work was Bloody Lowndes, the struggle for the vote in Lowndes County. So you have to have a mission, you have to have a purpose.
Yes.
And when you have We the Village, it is the village that lays the foundation for who we are.
Yes.
And even though they gave a little credit to Hillary Clinton when she said it takes a village to raise a child.
It's an African proverb.
The African proverb is more complete.
Yes.
It takes a whole village to raise a child.
Yes.
And that's, when you talk about my background, it was the whole village.
Yes.
Newark, New Jersey was not Brick City. That came later when they started building those high-rise apartments to jam us up.
Yes.
And they even, it wasn't just for black folks, because the Columbus homes were built from Branchbrook Park down to a Broad Street area. And the Columbus homes was almost like concentration camps. They didn't even have the spread that the Stella Wright and the other homes had. They were jammed into a small area, enormous 15-story buildings with very little. So in other words, there was a policy, an urban policy, of stacking up poor people in the urban areas to protect them from moving out, prevent them from moving out, going into suburbs.
Right.
So, but Newark was a city of communities. You had the Roseville area, that's where we grew up in the West End. You had further out into the West End, Ivy Hill, that's where the Irish community.
And the Ukrainians there.
And then you had the east part of Newark, which was Polish and other groups. And now it's many Brazilians. And then North Newark, you had a heavy Italian community. And in Central and South Newark, you had the Jewish community moving into the Wheat Creek area. So Newark, it was a collection of villages and communities that try to take care of their young people, inspire them and whatnot. So I'm very proud of having grown up in Newark, New Jersey, and give credit. Of the 100 kids I grew up with, 90 of us made it.
Nice.
And many of us made it big.
Nice.
14th Street, where I lived with my mother and father and my brother. On the next block was my mother's oldest sister. And on the next block was my father's oldest sister that raised him.
Your village.
That was truly the village.
Yes.
And we lived among white folks, but we had our institutions, we had our churches, we had every summer we went to camp, etc. And so that's controlling your socialization process and your acculturation process. So socialization is what you get in terms of your development from your family and strategic organizations. Acculturation is how you fit into society.
Right.
So when I try to teach and I Afrocentric, I try to use that history. I use the pyramid, I call it pyramid analysis.
Yes.
So I use this great symbol of human development, the triangle shape of the pyramid, and I call it pyramid analysis. At this polarity is what we call your foundation, your socialization. And that's how you become who you are.
Yes.
And your family has key role, and the women have the major role, and the elders. And then at this polarity is acculturation. How do you fit into the society?
The larger society.
And then that's when schooling,
Yes.
informal schooling, like we had in our community, we had Sunday school.
Yes.
So there was a woman in the Sunday school, Mrs. Smith. Now we would go knocking on the door, old Ronnie, old Bobby, old Sammy, and these black youngsters would go trucking down to the Sunday school. And Mrs. Smith was there to teach us Sunday school lessons, morality, understanding who you are, sharing, trust.
Character.
And character. And then on Monday, she'd have us come to her house for oatmeal cookies and milk. But she would continue the learning.
Yes.
After 50 years of Mrs. Smith, all of us, by the hundreds, were asked to come to East Orange in the Brick Church district to honor this woman who had a special role of putting her hands on these youngsters.
Village.
So, as that's the village. And now we're trying to raise children without the village. So I use this to process information.
Yes.
Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis.
I love it. That's a beautiful
Mind,
learning structure.
body, and spirit.
Right.
And we have to understand that thesis is the foundation. That's the ideas and the accumulation of things. But there's a law of opposites in the universe.
Yes.
And
Polarity,
so,
yin and yang.
Yin and yang, polarity. And this Africans understood. And this polarity, thesis, antithesis, the law of opposites. And then between these two, you have the synthesis.
And ma'at, balance.
And ma'at, and the balance. And so that balance is in the structure of the African building. So when you had your temples, the temples represented the balance. Each pillar in the great temple of the Nile,
Luxor Temple.
the Luxor Temple, each at the central court, each pillar represent a moral and ethical principle.
Yes.
So the architecture, how it was laid out and how it was designed, is also a teaching process.
Yes, it is.
And so you had the great building of the pyramids, which was designed to link the human spirit to the divine order of the universe.
Yes.
And then you had to have places where you sacredly taught this knowledge. And so you had the Great Lodge of Luxor, which is this. You had a similar lodge for the women, etc. But then you had symbols in your world that spoke to what you need to do with yourself. And so here is, this is what you call the Afrocentric knowledge.
Yes.
You don't get a better example of it than what you see here.
That's right. That
The
architecture,
pyramid
mathematics and science.
was a culture. You wanted to link yourself to the divine. So it was a tomb representing your transition to the next world.
Yes.
And then you had the learning process while you were on earth, and you had to be taught these special knowledges, and it was taught from heart to heart,
Yes.
from mouth to ear, so that you had a responsibility. You couldn't take the knowledge and not be correct. If you're going to learn it, you had to be correct. This is a culture 3000 BC.
Yes.
There's nothing in Europe. There's no Greeks. There's no Romans. There's African peoples along their river valleys, the Nile River Valley,
That's
the
right.
Blue Nile, the White Nile, the river valleys in the highlands of Ethiopia, etc.
Yes.
But
So I got about 1 minute left.
Okay, but see
I
that,
wanna ask you a
that
question.
symbol, that symbol in the middle is the key.
The obelisk.
That's the obelisk, that's the Tekken, that's the resurrection and rebirth. All life is a process of resurrection and rebirth. So when they built this nation, they went and took the African symbols and put the Washington Monument
Everywhere.
and the pillared temples like the Lincoln Memorial. And so we have to understand that there is a culture that we have given to the world. It's the culture that we need to put to complement the other knowledge we get from Asia, from Arabia, and from our Native Americans.
I want to do 2 seconds.
Yes.
2 seconds. How do you feel about candidate Kamala Harris before I have to shut down?
Well, because my mother was so important in our learning, and even though she was small and diminutive, and we had a giant father who was 6'5",
Yes.
she had the vision and the plans, and he followed he was not pulling away from her. He went along with it. So we had the power of the male and the female. In America, we've had too much imbalance.
Oh.
The Trump does not represent just Trump. He represents an imbalance in our culture. Too many old, dried up white men sitting in their chambers trying to figure out how not to do anything. And so even though we may say Kamala is not ready yet, or she has background that may not be what we want, I want the female in the mix.
Yes.
Because she's bringing something special. She has been, the divine order is in her, and it's manifested when she has children.
Right.
So she's got to have empathy. A male participates in the process, and he can have empathy or not, but he's got to be trained to be. I want these women, even though people may question whether she is ready. There was a fellow who is the mayor of one of the towns. He wants to run. Everybody wants to run.